In today's video, I will teach you how to use prepositions in relative clauses. Well, as we said before in a previous video, because this video is a continuation in a series of videos about relative pronouns and relative clauses. So, in a previous video, I mentioned the reason why relative clauses are called relative clauses. They are named so because they begin with a relative pronoun. Some relative pronouns cannot be preceded by prepositions. So, for example, the relative pronoun who cannot have a preposition before it. That cannot have a preposition before it. Also, where and when cannot have prepositions before them. We have only 3 relative pronouns which can have prepositions before them. These are whose, which, and whom. Let's begin with whose. As we said earlier in a previous video, whose is a relative pronoun that's used to refer to the idea of possession or ownership. So, when whose refers to a thing, I'm not talking here about referring to a person or an animal or a living thing, but when whose is used in a relative clause to refer to a thing, it is normally followed by a noun, but we can replace it with the structure noun plus of which. So as you can see, we can replace who, which is followed by a noun, by the same noun, and we follow it with of which. Let me give you an example to indicate that. A huge amount of oil was spilled, and whose effects have not been felt yet. Whose in this example is followed by the noun effects. But we can replace the phrase whose effects with effects of which, you see? So instead of putting the noun after whose, we put it before the new relative pronoun, which is which, and we use of which. Again, a huge amount of oil was spilled, and whose effects and the effects of which have not been felt yet. All right, so this is the first point, which is that we can replace whose plus noun with the same noun plus of which. As I said in the beginning of the video, whose is one of those relative pronouns which can be preceded by a preposition. However, this option is deemed formal, is considered formal and more common in written English. Less formally, we tend to delay the preposition until the end of the relative clause. Let me give you an example. The council is in discussion with Lord Thomas on whose land most of the village is built. On whose land. So we are putting the preposition here before whose, and that's the formal way of doing it. But we can delay the preposition until the end of the relative clause in order to make the sentence less formal. So we can say instead, the council is in discussion with Lord Thomas, whose land most of the village is built on. You see, the preposition on has been delayed until the end of the sentence. So the point I was trying to make here is that formally you place the preposition directly before whose. Less formally, you delay the preposition until the end of the relative clause. Whom is another relative pronoun which can be preceded by a preposition. For example, we can say, her many friends, among whom I like to be considered, gave her encouragement. You see, whom here is preceded by a preposition which is among. Let me say the sentence one more time. Her many friends, among whom I like to be considered, gave her encouragement. So whom, just like whose, can be preceded by a preposition. In this example, it was among. And the same applies on which. At the beginning of the video, I said that we have 3 relative pronouns which can be preceded by prepositions. We talked about whose, we talked about whom, and now I'll give you an example on placing a preposition before which. For instance, you can say, the rate at which a material heats up depends on its chemical composition. At which. So which is directly preceded by the preposition at. Let me say the example one more time. The rate at which a material heats up depends on its chemical composition. Be careful that although who and whom are interchangeable when the relative clause acts as the object, and this is something that we explained at depth in the main video about relative pronouns and relative clauses. So normally, if whom is used in a relative clause, it will definitely be referring to the object, and so it can be replaced by who. But there is one case in which who cannot be replaced by whom. Whom cannot be replaced by who. When? That's when whom is preceded by a preposition. Only whom can be used after a preposition. Whom cannot be placed after a preposition. Okay? Let's move to another point. Right. Sometimes, however, you delay the preposition until later in the sentence. As I said, this option is considered to be less formal than placing the preposition right before the relative pronoun. This is a very important point. It's a primary point that I need to reiterate. With the 3 relative pronouns, whom, whose, and which, you can place the preposition either directly before them or later in the relative clause, but placing the preposition directly before them is deemed or considered to be more formal than delaying the preposition to the end of the relative clause. For example, the playground wasn't used by the children for whom it was built. For whom. That's formal. Let's make it less formal. The playground wasn't used by the children whom it was built for. So we delayed the preposition for until the end of the relative clause. And in this particular option, because the preposition has been delayed, we can replace whom with who. So we can say, the playground wasn't used by the children who it was built for or whom it was built for. And we cannot overlook phrasal verbs when we talk about prepositions. So, because all phrasal verbs contain prepositions naturally. So if the verb in the relative clause is a phrasal verb, which is a verb and a preposition as a package, we can put the preposition right before the relative pronoun, but this is considered absolutely formal. For example, she's one of the few people to whom I look up, which means that I look up to a few people and she's one of them. To whom I look up, as you can see, we're placing to before the relative pronoun whom. That's extremely formal. If you want to dilute the register a little bit, make it less formal, we can say she's one of the few people whom I look up to, or who I look up to, rather than saying to whom I look up, which is placing the preposition of the phrasal verb directly before the relative pronoun. And here I bring this video to a close. It was about how to use prepositions with relative pronouns in relative clauses. I hope it was a helpful video for you, an informative and enlightening one. If you find my content educational and appealing to you, please subscribe to the channel, interact with the video through liking it, sharing it with your friends and family members, and leave down in the comment box any comments if you want to share any of your ideas or thoughts with me. I'd be more than glad to respond to your comments. Thank you very much for your attentive listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.